1950s, the world saw an increase in air passenger travel. Travel was becoming easier and the planes were improving because they were no longer using propeller engines. This was the beginning of the jet age, and one of the companies leading the way was Pan American Airways. At the same time, Japan was rebuilding itself from the damage of World War II. America was helping in that process, and the relationship between the two countries were becoming closer. There was a growing interest in trans-Pacific travel because people were now more aware of Asia than before the war. Because of this, business was booming for Japan. This could be seen with the rise of Japan Airlines, which began to challenge Pan Am's dominance of global travel, especially in the Pacific. Hawaii State Senator Glenn Mackay has a unique perspective, as his mother was a Pan Am stewardess.
She started at Pan Am in the 1950s. She was the first group of Pan Am stewardesses when Pan Am decided to go trans-Pacific. Pan Am was a growing entity, and much of what their travel plans were was in North, South America, as well as Europe. They wanted to expand into the Pacific after World War II, kind of during the Korean War.
To answer this challenge, Pan Am management, including Chief Sales Executive Ernest Albert, came out with a plan. They decided to focus on bridging the language barrier and improving on their already renowned quality service. Their strategy including hiring stewardesses who were fluent in Japanese and familiar with Japanese culture. Pan Am had certain requirements for these stewardesses. The company focused its search on Hawaii because there were a large pool of young Japanese American women to choose from. They had to be at least 5'2", unmarried, had no children, in their 20s, and most importantly, they had to be able to speak English and Japanese.
Well, I was working at a Venetian blind company in Honolulu, and one day I received a call from a gentleman who spoke Japanese, and I answered him in Japanese, and I was a little rusty at the time. Both my parents are first generation Japanese. I'm Nisei. And he asked me how tall I was, and I thought, oh my, this fella is fresh. So anyway, I answered his question, and he came in and made an appointment with my boss, met my boss, and he said, oh, you're tall enough. And he said, why don't you apply at Pan Am? So my hiring was quite accidental. I was quite lucky.
Well, you know, I was a teacher at an intermediate school, actually. And when I told my mother about it, she was shocked that I was going to do that and give up my teaching career. But I told her I would be there only for about a year.
The stewardesses of Pan Am became role models for other airline stewardesses. People around the world looked up to them for their quality service and become international icons.
I was flying during the time, you probably never heard of her, but her name is Jackie Kennedy. And she was a wife of the President Kennedy. So this was called a pillbox hat. Well, when we flew, you had to wear a hat whenever you were in uniform, except when the doors were closed on the plane. So we had to when we checked into work, we had to be in full uniform. You always had to have a hat, and you had to wear the hat even when you walked in the terminal. If you stopped at a coffee shop, you always had to have your hat on and gloves.
But what might not be as well known is their humanitarian work.
My mom had a unique role for the airlines because of her ability to speak, and my mom was a really nice, kind, and sweet person. She was in charge of all the orphans, and there were a lot of Americans who were adopting children from Japan as well as Korea. So my mom would be in charge of bringing them over, because could you imagine, you're a 1-year-old, maybe a 2-year-old from Japan, you're coming to a brand new life, you have no idea what to expect. It's super fearful, right? So my mom would be in charge of making sure as best she could to make that transition smooth for these little kids. And what's kind of funny was that a lot of times they were transitioning from Tokyo, from Seoul, South Korea, to the mainland. And they would arrive in Hawaii on one day, but their next connecting flight wasn't until the next day. And my mom wouldn't just leave them there at the airport for the Pan Am personnel to take care of, she actually took them home. She took them home to feed them, bathe them, put them to sleep, and then took them back to the airport the next day for their new life on the mainland.
The Nisei stewardesses reunite occasionally. Their experience working at Pan Am is kept alive by newsletters and reunions. The highlight of these get-togethers was their 50th anniversary reunion in 2005. Their legacy is also perpetuated through the book Airborne Dreams, written by University of Hawaii Professor Christine Yano.
The women that I spoke with all were so enthusiastic about Pan Am. They enjoyed their work tremendously because it shaped who they became. They became women who knew the world. And you might call it, they became worldly. They became what might be called cosmopolitan. It made them knowledgeable. It made them into people who conceived of the world beyond just what's going on in Hawaii. And it absolutely shaped who they were. So if you ask me, were they enthusiastic? Did they like their job? I'd say absolutely yes, because it had such a profound impact upon them.
Without the help of these women, you might say that air travel in the Pacific might have been much different and Pan Am wouldn't have achieved the success that they did during that period. So the next time you fly on a plane, think of the pioneering work that the Nisei stewardesses did. Their legacy will always be remembered.